this was a Britain suffering from a major slump. What are your own retrospective reflections on the slump in the 30s, on economic policy and the behaviour or success or failure of the national government?
Well, it has to go back further, you know. The great misfortune, I think, was the attempt to return to gold at the old parity in the 1920s, which in a sense was quite unnecessary, because as I was pointing out at the time, when I came to England, but too late, David Ricardo had argued 100 years before that he would never advise the government to restore a currency depreciated by 30% to its former par. If a single English economist had recalled this and quoted it, the fight against the return at the former parity might have been won. But Keynes used the opportunity to protest against the return to gold in any form. So unfortunately it was done in the return at the former parity. And Keynes was convinced by that stage, perhaps as a fact correctly, that with the strength British trade unions had achieved, you could no longer hope to maintain aggregate demand at a constant value of money, and he hoped that by a gradual and slow decrease of the value of money you could overcome the resistance of rigid wages. Well, that was the situation I found, and which led me in a conflict with Keynes, and most of my years in England, I can't say, the first 10 years, because then the situation became even more peculiar. Keynes became largely responsible for British monetary policy, but at the same time...
This is during the war?
It's during the war, yes. But at the same time, he was the one who would resist inflation at the time. And so, having been criticizing Keynes during the 30s, I refrained from doing so because I wanted him to keep in power, because the alternative would have been even worse.
But why do you think that the general theory, which came out in 36, and with which you disagreed and many other economists, why did it have such enormous influence?
Well, I wish I knew. I was puzzled by the time. In fact, I did not believe it would succeed, so much so that while I had spent a year analyzing in great detail his earlier books, the Treatise on Money, and then only to hear from him by the time the second part of my criticism was published, I no longer believe in all that. And I didn't want to invest more effort in criticizing the general theory, whose success is still a puzzle to me, because it reverted to a very primitive idea which had been clearly refuted in the 19th century, that there's a single relation between the aggregate demand for final products and the employment. So much so that Leslie Stephen in the 1880s had pointed out the test of a good economist is that he does not make that particular mistake. Well, Keynes revived it and gave a plausible explanation. And I should add, he did not succeed while he lived. But when he died, he was suddenly raised to sainthood.
But Keynes might not have approved of the Keynesianism which came to dominate policy.
He wouldn't. In fact, I can positively say so. The very last time I saw him, about 6 weeks before his death, I was meeting him as I was still having dining rights at King's College, and I was here for a weekend, and talked to him after dinner and asked him whether he wasn't alarmed by what his pupils, naming two, I won't name now, were doing, agitating for more expansion, while in fact the danger clearly was inflation. He completely agreed with me and assured me my theory was frightfully important in the 1930s with the question of combating deflation. Trust me, if inflation ever becomes a danger, I'm going to turn public opinion around like this. 6 weeks he was dead, and later he was dead and couldn't do it. I think he would have been fighting the inflationary policy.